So in 2025, the world basically agreed that it takes about $1.3 trillion a year to protect the planet from the worst effects of climate change.
Right, a massive number.
Yeah, exactly. 1.3 trillion. But then in Baku, at COP29, the world's wealthiest nations brought exactly 300 billion to the table.
Which is, a huge shortfall.
It's a massive gap. So today we're doing a deep dive into that $1 trillion missing puzzle piece.
And how a fight over two seemingly innocent words, all actors, almost broke the entire Paris Agreement.
Exactly. Welcome to the show, everyone. We are taking you into the war room of global climate negotiations today.
We really are. We're looking closely at the COP29 summit that took place in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Right. That was from November 11th to the 24th, 2025. Okay, let's unpack this, because what happened in Baku goes far beyond just environmental policy.
Oh, absolutely.
It is a high-stakes arena of geopolitics, national security, and, economic survival, really. If you're studying this or preparing to analyze it, you need to pay attention.
Yeah, framing this as a geopolitical battleground is really the only way to truly understand what unfolded there.
Right. So where do we start?
Well, to make sense of Baku, we have to look at the structural trigger for these negotiations. These summits, the conferences of the parties, are the mechanism where governments conduct what's called a global stocktake.
A global stocktake. Okay, so they're basically grading their own homework.
Exactly. They grade their own homework on the Paris Agreement's core objective, which is limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Right, and the official theme for COP29 was investing in a livable planet for all. Sounds great on paper.
It does, but the structural crisis driving the agenda is that developing nations are absorbing the absolute worst impacts of climate change right now.
Yeah, the floods, the droughts, it's happening today.
And meanwhile, the legacy financial commitments,
Yeah.
specifically that old, vastly inadequate $100 billion funding goal set years ago, were just completely failing.
Which is why anyone tasked with strategic analysis needs to pay close attention to this shift, right? Climate finance is no longer just some metric for environmental virtue.
No, not at all. It has morphed into a brutal contest for strategic autonomy.
Yeah, countries are fighting to ensure their economic transitions don't just become these massive debt traps.
Exactly. So before we get into the massive diplomatic standoffs that really define this summit, let's map the battlefield a bit.
Good idea. We need to look at the mechanisms and the hard targets that were actually put on the table in Baku.
Right. So the foundational mechanism to understand from this summit is the NCQG.
Okay, NCQG. Let's define that for the listeners.
That stands for the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance.
Got it.
This was the headline breakthrough, or, well, depending on your perspective, the headline fracture of the whole event.
Yeah, definitely a fracture for some.
The agreement they reached was to triple climate finance for developing countries, setting a target of $300 billion per year by 2035.
With developed countries taking the lead in mobilization, right?
That's the official language, yes.
Okay, I have to pause on that framing, though. Tripling the baseline fund to $300 billion a year on paper, that gets sold as a massive victory.
Oh, the PR spin was heavy.
A 200% increase from the old goal sounds like a massive win for global governance. But that number exists in a vacuum. Let's look at the actual requirement.
Right. The calculated structural requirement for mitigation and adaptation across the developing world is $1.3 trillion annually.
From all public and private sources.
Exactly. So the gap between the $300 billion pledged and the $1.3 trillion actually needed became the primary fault line of the entire conference.
I can imagine. The Global South looked at that number and just saw a fundamental disconnect between the scale of the crisis and the capital being offered.
Yeah, it's like, think about it this way. It's like being quoted $130,000 to fix a crumbling foundation on your house.
Right, your house is literally falling apart.
And the bank graciously offers you a $30,000 loan at like 8% interest.
Wow. Yeah, that doesn't actually fix the house.
No, it doesn't. And now you're just burdened with new debt while the floor collapses underneath you.
That captures the structural frustration perfectly. But the finance goal wasn't the only mechanism finalized, right?
No, a critical operational development was the agreement on Article 6.2 of the UN framework.
Article 6.2, this is the legal architecture for carbon markets, right?
Yeah, exactly. It finalizes the rules for country-to-country bilateral trading of carbon credits. It's essentially attempting to create a centralized global ledger for carbon.
Okay, let's explain the how of that for a second. If I'm building a briefing on this, how does Article 6.2 actually function in the real world?
Sure. So imagine country A preserves a massive mangrove forest that absorbs 1 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere.
Okay, great for country A.
Right. Meanwhile, country B has a heavy steel industry that it simply cannot transition to green energy overnight.
They need more time, but they have emission targets to hit.
Exactly. So Article 6.2 creates the verified international ledger where country A can sell that absorbed carbon credit to country B.
Ah, okay. So country B gets to meet its emission targets, and country A gets paid for its natural resources.
You've got it. But the real friction in Baku is about the math, ensuring that the same ton of absorbed carbon isn't claimed on the national scorecards of both country A and country B.
Right. That double counting issue has been an absolute nightmare for years.
It really has.
So having a finalized ledger is a massive administrative step forward. Alongside that, we also saw the methane declaration.
Yes, over 30 countries endorsed a pact to reduce methane emissions specifically from organic waste.
And they are encouraging nations to bake sectoral targets into their NDCs.
They're nationally determined contributions, exactly, which are essentially the individual climate pledges each country makes to the UN.
But I want to specifically flag a critical detail here for you listening.
Yeah.
India chose not to be a signatory to this methane clause.
Right, they opted out. And that decision points to a broader theme of protecting domestic policy space, which we will analyze shortly.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. But if we look beneath the headline numbers, the institutional shifts occurring are profound. We saw movement on the loss and damage fund, too.
We did. This is the mechanism designed to compensate nations for climate destruction that has already happened.
Stuff that can no longer be adapted to, like the island is already sinking.
Exactly.
Huh.
The focus in Baku was on the governance of that fund, trying to figure out how to equitably distribute capital directly to impacted communities rather than, losing it all in bureaucratic overhead.
Yeah, makes sense. There was also an extension of the Lima Work Program on gender for another 10 years, setting the stage for a new gender action plan at COP30.
And then there's an initiative with a very telling name, the Baku Harmonia Climate Initiative for Farmers.
Yeah, Harmonia. It sounds like an attempt to bring some order to a highly chaotic system.
That is the exact intention. The global landscape of agricultural climate initiatives is just incredibly fragmented right now.
So Harmonia is designed as a consolidating platform.
Yes. The mechanism here is to streamline access. I mean, if you are a developing nation trying to build climate-resilient agriculture, you shouldn't have to navigate 50 different overlapping bureaucratic frameworks just to access funding.
Right, that's incredibly inefficient. So Harmonia aims to centralize that support.
Furthermore, the summit laid down a mandate for 2025. Member states must submit revised, highly ambitious NDCs, transitioning away from fossil fuels to keep that 1.5-degree limit mathematically possible.
Okay, so all of these mechanisms, the carbon ledgers, the agricultural platforms, the $300 billion pledge, they all set the stage for the defining moment of COP29.
The walkout.
Because a treaty is only as strong as its consensus. And here's where it gets really interesting. In Baku, the Global South drew a massive, uncrossable red line.
They absolutely did.
India outright rejected the core finance deal. They walked away from the NCQG, calling the $300 billion pledge woefully inadequate.
And to understand the weight of that walkout, we have to dissect the rationale behind it. It was not merely a protest over the total dollar amount.
Right. It wasn't just about the money. It was about how the money was structured.
The conflict was rooted in the mechanism of the money. India didn't just point to the $1.3 trillion requirement. The specific demand was that at least $600 billion of that total must be provided in the form of grants.
Grants or grant equivalent resources.
Exactly. The defining issue was rejecting debt.
Because, let's be real. A loan means a developing nation is paying back principal and interest for the privilege of fixing a climate crisis they largely did not create.
Spot on. A grant is actual structural assistance.
Oh.
A loan is just a new financial burden.
Which brings us to the legal and historical argument at the center of the dispute.
Yes, the entire framework of global climate negotiations rests on Article 9 of the Paris Agreement.
And that's built on a concept called CBDR, right?
Yes, CBDR common, but differentiated responsibilities.
Okay, if you are studying this, underline CBDR. Let's define it, because it is the linchpin of this whole debate.
So, the common part means every nation on Earth shares the overarching goal of preventing climate collapse. We all live here.
We all want to survive, right?
But the differentiated part is the acknowledgement of historical reality. It states that the developed nations who spent the last 150 years burning fossil fuels to industrialize, build their economies, and accumulate wealth have a fundamentally different and much greater financial responsibility to clean up the atmosphere.
Compared to nations still trying to lift their populations out of poverty today.
Exactly. Article 9 explicitly places the legal burden of mobilizing climate finance squarely on developed nations.
But the final text in Baku attempted a subtle but honestly massive legal pivot.
They tried to change the wording.
Right. The text called on all actors to scale up financing.
And that phrase, all actors, was the spark that ignited the walkout.
We have to look at this impartially, though, and understand the friction from both sides of the table. Why were developed nations fighting so hard to include the phrase all actors?
Well, from the perspective of developed nations like the U.S. or European countries, the economic map of the world has changed drastically since these frameworks were first conceived in the early 1990s.
Right. The world looks very different now.
They argue that economies like China and India have grown exponentially. Today, they are massive global economies and currently rank among the world's top absolute emitters of carbon.
So they're saying the old definitions don't apply.
Right. The argument from the developed side is that the old binary division of the world into developed and developing no longer reflects current economic realities.
And therefore, these emerging economic powerhouses need to transition from being recipients of climate finance to contributors.
That's their stance. They want the financial burden shared among all actors who have the current economic capacity.
But the counter-argument from India and the Global South is that carbon doesn't just disappear at the end of the fiscal year.
No, it stays up there.
Climate change is driven by the cumulative historical accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere over a century and a half, not just a snapshot of today's emissions.
And that is the crux of the legal argument. India argued that shifting the language to all actors dilutes historical responsibility.
It lets the historically heavy emitters off the hook.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
It violates the foundational spirit of Article 9. They refuse to allow the burden to be quietly shifted onto the shoulders of developing nations.
And this stance was not taken in an isolated vacuum either. India utilized this moment to throw its diplomatic weight behind the most vulnerable nations on the planet.
The least developed countries, the LDCs, and the small island developing states, the SIDs.
These are the nations dealing with literal existential threats right now. We are talking sea level rise, swallowing coastlines, extreme weather, wiping out entire GDPs.
They walked out of the negotiations, stating their survival needs were just being completely ignored.
And India backing their walkout is a profound demonstration of shifting geopolitical architecture.
It really is. India is asserting leadership through powerful blocs like the LMDC, the like-minded developing countries, and the BASIC group.
Let's make sure we define BASIC for everyone tracking the geopolitical alliances. That's Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, 4 of the most influential emerging economies in the world.
When India leads within these groups, it transforms from a participant in global forums to an architect of global South diplomacy.
It's a pure exercise in strategic autonomy.
Yes, but we also have to connect this international diplomacy directly to domestic national security. This isn't just about scoring diplomatic points in Baku.
Right, because climate finance is inextricably tied to border stability and defense. We always say you have to connect the dots.
Exactly. If we view this through a defense lens, India's demand for an operational, fully funded loss and damage mechanism is actually about internal security.
Give me an example of that.
We are talking about catastrophic floods in border regions, shifting monsoons, and intensifying cyclones on the coasts. These events wipe out critical border infrastructure.
Oh, wow. Yeah, if roads to the border are washed out, that's a defense issue.
Precisely. They destroy agricultural yields, which leads to massive internal migration and economic displacement. If a nation cannot finance climate resilience, its domestic stability degrades rapidly.
Protecting the borders means protecting the environment within them.
Exactly. And what gave India the ability to draw such a hard line on the global stage is that they brought domestic data to the negotiating table.
They weren't just making demands, they were leveraging their own proven track record.
Yes. India showed up highlighting a 33 to 35% reduction in emission intensity.
Okay, let's clarify the mechanism of emission intensity because it is a crucial concept. It does not mean India capped its total absolute emissions, right?
Correct. It means the economy is continuing to grow rapidly, but the amount of carbon emitted per unit of GDP has dropped significantly.
It proves that economic growth is finally being decoupled from carbon pollution.
Which is the holy grail for a developing economy, coupled with the staggering fact that India has already met 40% of its energy capacity from non-fossil fuel
Well,
sources.
40%, that completely changes the dynamic of the negotiation.
It does. India can look across the table and say, we are executing our nationally determined contributions. We are greening our grid. Now, where is the structural financial support you are historically obligated to provide?
It's a very strong hand to play. So if you are listening to this because you need to synthesize these events for a strategic briefing or an exam,
Yeah.
how do you pull all these threads together?
That's the real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, how do we build a framework that captures the $300 billion gap, the Article 6.2 ledgers, the fight over historical responsibility, and the national security implications?
The key to high-level analysis here is what I call the interlinking engine. You cannot treat Copay 29 as an isolated two-week summit.
Right, it doesn't exist in a vacuum.
You have to connect India's climate diplomacy to its broader governance patterns. For example, the walkout in Baku is a direct international extension of Atmanirbhar Bharat.
The policy of self-reliance.
Yes, it is about protecting inclusive domestic growth.
Because rejecting a debt-heavy finance deal protects self-reliance. It ensures climate mitigation doesn't become a debt trap that just, pledges future revenues to foreign creditors.
Furthermore, you have to link this to global technology transformation. India uses platforms like the International Solar Alliance, the ISA, and the Lifestyle for Environment Movement Life to assert global leadership on its own terms.
Rather than just reacting to Western mandates.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're stepping into a meeting to present this analysis or sitting down to write an exam answer, your core argument shouldn't just be a timeline of what happened on what day.
Right, don't just give a history lesson. An executive briefing framework builds itself if you structure it around 3 analytical pillars.
Yes. First, establish the context. Talk about the 1.5-degree survival threshold and the mandate of the global stocktake.
Start with the big picture.
Second, outline the operational mechanics. This means detailing the Article 6.2 carbon markets, the loss and damage governance, and the Harmonia Agricultural Initiative.
Show you know the specific programs, and then you move to your third pillar, right, the critical evaluation.
Exactly. This is where you detail the friction, the vast gulf between the 300 billion pledged and the 1.3 trillion required.
And the legal sleight of hand pulling all actors into the text to dilute Article 9?
You have to mention that. And finally, you conclude by framing India's rejection not as obstructionism, but as a defense of climate justice and equitable partnerships for the global south.
Okay, if you are taking notes for this framework, there is specific administrative vocabulary you need to deploy to show you truly understand the architecture of the debate.
Buzzwords matter here.
They do. You need to use the term NCQG for the finance goal. You need to reference Article 6.2 when discussing carbon trading.
You must mention CBDR when explaining historical responsibility.
And you should reference initiatives like LIFE and the Mangrove Alliance for Climate to show the proactive steps being taken outside the UN framework.
To wrap our analysis, though, we really have to look at the way forward.
Yeah, what is the administrative path out of this deadlock?
Well, it requires the strengthening of existing multilateral institutions like the Green Climate Fund to restore trust.
Trust is definitely at a low point right now.
It absolutely demands enhancing public-private partnerships to mobilize that missing $1 trillion. Governments alone aren't going to find it.
But crucially, it requires regulatory reforms that prioritize grants over loans. We've said it before, but the world's most vulnerable nations cannot be crushed by debt while trying to build seawalls.
And fundamentally, the path forward requires genuine technological cooperation, empowering developing countries with actual unrestricted technology transfer, rather than just, empty promises of future capital.
Okay, let's lock this in before we go. We are going to do a rapid-fire revision volley to solidify the memory anchors for you.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
What's the headline number from Baku?
The NCQG, $300 billion a year promised by 2035, against a structural reality of $1.3 trillion actually needed.
Got it. The carbon market mechanism.
Article 6.2, establishing the legal bilateral ledger for country-to-country carbon trading and addressing the double counting problem.
And the diplomatic red line.
India strategically rejecting the finance deal, demanding grant-based funding rather than loans, and fighting the all-actors language that diluted historical responsibility.
And what was their domestic leverage?
Negotiating from a position of proven execution, having already hit 40% non-fossil energy capacity and reducing emission intensity by up to 35%.
Finally, the institutional shift in agriculture.
The launch of the Baku Harmonia initiative to consolidate and streamline the chaotic landscape of global climate finance for farmers.
Perfect. If you need to summarize this entire summit in one core analytical question, it is this. How did the outcomes of COP29 in Baku force a reevaluation of global climate finance? And how did India use the concept of strategic autonomy to redefine climate justice?
And the key words to anchor that analysis are strategic autonomy, climate justice, global stocktake, capacity building, and emission intensity.
Your analytical framework is now fully built. You have the economic data, the geopolitical context, and the legal arguments from both sides of the table.
But we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Let's hear it.
We talked about Article 6.2, finally codifying international carbon markets.
Right.
If carbon credits truly become the new global currency, will developing nations finally get paid fairly for preserving their natural resources? Or, by creating a global trading ledger, are we just witnessing the ultimate financialization of the very air we breathe?
Wow. That is the trillion-dollar question hanging over the next summit. The map is drawn, the remaining resources are on the table, and the negotiations for the future of the planet's economy are just getting started. Keep these frameworks in mind, and you will be able to decode exactly what happens next.